Welcome back. I'm Byron White. I'm Vice President for University Engagement, Chief Diversity Officer here. I see a lot of mostly familiar faces, people who have been to listen to other speakers in this series. We appreciate you joining us again for Dr. David Morass. I will tell you just, David, for many of us who've been thinking about ways universities and communities connect, Davis is a very familiar name, partly because his book, Beyond the Campus, which was published in 2001, really is sort of a foundational text for a lot of the thinking about how universities and communities figure out ways to work together, and really looked at cases that were emerging and partnerships that were emerging. He has since really focused around not just universities, but other kinds of anchor institutions. And so we're gonna, in some ways, as our series moves on, this shifts our attention a little bit away from the way just we organize ourselves internally to the way the world outside the academy connects from the vantage point of communities and how that works. David is the founder and president of Maurrasse Incorporated, which does consulting around the country with foundations and institutions and universities and others around partnerships and how they work. He actually just has written 4 books, the 4th of which has just come out, which is Strategic, Public-Private.
You have it right there.
Oh, there it is on the table. And so he's continued to do that work. And in his capacity at Maurrasse, in partnership with the Netter Center for Community Partnerships and Ira Harkavy at University of Pennsylvania, has helped to put together this national anchor institution task force, which is starting to really drive a lot of the strategic thinking on the role of anchor institutions and the opportunities for community transformation through that work. And so that is his topic for today. And so with that, I'd like to introduce David Morass.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? Yes. All right, good. Good to be here on this rainy day. Hopefully it'll clear up soon. So, but thank you so much. I've been here for several hours now, both today and yesterday, and getting to see the campus a little bit, and it's been a pleasure, and people have been very gracious and welcoming, so I appreciate the Cleveland hospitality. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this notion of anchor institutions, as Byron mentioned, and talk about universities as anchor institutions, and how communities and anchor institutions can collaboratively work to address some of the critical needs that communities face. And in a lot of ways, I think some of this kind of work is essential, maybe more essential than some people have expressed. And I also think it's an opportunity. I think there is a real opportunity for universities and other types of anchor institutions to really help fulfill and strengthen their own missions and their own priorities by way of collaborative partnerships in communities. So that's just a theme that I think is going to run through a little bit of what I'm going to say. So thank you very much. So I just wanted to say just a few things about higher education and the context, and these are all critical areas that are very relevant to what higher education is dealing with, right? So you can think of connecting in communities and partnerships in communities as a nuisance, given that there are all these challenges out there facing colleges and universities in terms of budgetary challenges and even the notion of place as far as universities are concerned, and the fact that there is so much online education going on right now. Is the place-based aspect of higher education threatened in some way, shape, or form? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that people are asking, and people wondering about the value of higher education as well. And so when you've got all those kinds of challenges out there, why add another thing like community partnerships? It's going to be time consuming, it's going to things of that sort. So I think it's important to really look in the context of all the challenges higher education faces and wonder about the degree to which anchor institution engagement and partnerships in local communities can actually be an opportunity to address some of the challenges that higher education faces, rather than one extra thing that makes life in higher education even more difficult. So I think that's a part of the challenge that we all face and we all have to really think about. And I do think that there are some interesting trends that position higher education very interestingly in these times, and could be significant opportunities going into the future, such as the fact that we are kind of in a knowledge economy, and there really is a need for highly skilled labor, and labor that really in some ways can be nurtured through the higher educational experience. And so what does that mean for higher education? And are there opportunities in community partnerships that are in fact connected to that as well? And just the fact that economic growth is really based on knowledge. And so higher education and so much of what comes out of higher education has been driving much of the global economy. So while there are constraints, there are also opportunities. And then there's some realities in municipalities. Municipalities everywhere, all across the country. Of course, it's not all equal, but there are some real strains on local budgets. And municipalities are really looking to their local institutions that have certain amounts of assets as potential partners to help address the kinds of critical issues that government is sort of charged with addressing. So I think that's another interesting trend that's a contextual factor that could be really relevant in thinking about this further. So anchor institutions, just as a notion. So what are we talking about, anchor institutions? Is that a good thing, or is it something else? And when I say anchors, and when a lot of people in the field who are working on the role of anchor institutions say it, we're really talking about institutions that have a vested interest in their surrounding areas. They are rooted in their local communities. It is difficult for them to leave their communities. So they therefore have a real stake in what goes on in their localities. And so part of the reason that's important is because as we think about transforming local communities, how do we in some way leverage the fact that there is that ongoing vested interest for anchor institutions in a way that can be beneficial to a number of different parties in local communities? And there are various types of anchor institutions. I mean, we think of institutions of higher education partly because they are significant. They remain in their areas for substantial amounts of time. They have significant land holdings. They have a substantial economic capital. They have physical capital. In many ways, they have a lot of employees. They have a lot of contracts with local businesses. These are some of the characteristics that people think of when they think of anchor institutions. But there are lots of other factors as well that can come into play in terms of, for example, institutional mission. So something like a community foundation can be anchored in a surrounding community because its mission is tied to place. It is tied to a locality. And so if it leaves that locality, it ceases to exist as it exists in its mission. It would become an entirely different entity. So there are lots of factors to take into account when you think about anchor institutions. But you think of museums, you think of libraries, you think of lots of other entities, hospitals, that are rooted and consistent in their surrounding communities. So that's just part of the anchor institution definition. And I mentioned some of the characteristics of anchor institutions: significant employers and purchasers. They have a lot of capital and bring tremendous assets to the table. And it's interesting that many of today's anchor institutions are nonprofit organizations. And that is a part of the intriguing story when it comes to anchor institutions. Because in many cities, particularly a lot of cities in what some people would refer to as the Rust Belt, like here in Cleveland, the anchor institutions of the past would be manufacturing corporations. They would be steel mills, they would be paper mills, they would be lots of different types of manufacturing companies. And certainly manufacturing still exists. It hasn't disappeared. But as capital left communities, as it flew away from communities and went to other parts of the country and other parts of the world, you really began to ask the question, well, okay, if those manufacturing companies are not present, then where are the jobs? Where are the opportunities? What is the heart of the local economy? And so anchor institutions sort of rose to the surface for a lot of people as they were beginning to think about what are the strategies, the economic strategies for localities into the future. Where are the institutions that you can actually build on in a way that can be beneficial to surrounding communities and that can actually drive local economies? And so anchor institutions, ironically, are sort of nonprofit organizations in a lot of contexts. Certainly there can be for-profit entities that are loyal and rooted in surrounding communities, but often the market forces drive different dynamics for those institutions, which oftentimes force them to leave or take parts of their work to other places. And so anchor institutions are a little bit more reliable and a little bit more rooted in that sense. So that's another aspect of anchors. And institutions of higher education as anchor institutions is really critical in this space. You know, as I look at what goes on in the field, as was mentioned, some of the work that we do with the Anchor Institutions Task Force, which is a membership association, which I'll talk a little bit more about. This entity is really driven by people who are at institutions of higher education. People who are at colleges and universities have in a lot of ways catalyzed and anchor institutions movement around the country, that they have really thought about this idea of being an anchor institution as something that is critical to solving community and economic challenges. And another thing I want to say about the way the Anchor Institutions Task Force has thought about anchor institutions is that there is an objective reality of being grounded in a community and having a lot of capital and having a lot of jobs and contracts. That's an objective reality. But there's an aspirational idea as it relates to anchor institutions. So you can be a grounded institution that's rooted with a lot of capital, but not necessarily an institution that is substantially engaged in the surrounding community. And so a lot of us see the need to have ongoing activity in a field of work of anchor institutions, but we are trying to encourage a different type of activity and a different type of philosophy as it relates to anchor institutions, whether they're universities or other types of institutions. But colleges and universities really stand out among anchor institutions because they bring so much capital to the table, and it's such a breadth and such a variety of different types of capital, from the human to the physical to the intellectual and beyond. So higher education is really well suited to do so many different things in local areas, and we see that going on lots of campuses around the country, whether it's service learning, whether it's applied research, whether it's creative strategies to do economic development. There are a number of different things that are going on around the country at colleges and universities, and in a lot of ways that has really been catalytic in leading a national conversation about why anchor institutions can be important components in solving some of the most critical problems facing localities. So higher education is absolutely critical in that sense. And I say this notion of sticky capital, truly sticky capital, in the sense that it sticks. It doesn't get up and go. It doesn't fly away. Higher education really does fit that category. And there's this tremendous interdependence and sort of interflowing between institutions of higher education and their surrounding communities, whether that's in rural college towns or in urban universities like this one. So the conditions of a surrounding community are still critical to the way people view a university, to the way faculty view a university and whether they want to stay in that community, to the way students view a university, whether they want to attend or whether they want to remain or whether they want to remain after graduation. All of those factors are integrated with place. I was having an interesting conversation early yesterday with a dean at Boston University who was telling me that Boston University got 53,000 applications this year. And it's the most they've ever had, but it's also the most in the country this year. And this person was telling me that part of the reason why this has happened is simply because of place, is because of the fact that people want to be in Boston, not necessarily at that particular university. And so that's an important trend to think about when we look at anchor institutions, and when we think about the fact that higher education and knowledge has become very fluid and apparently not tied to place, but yet still colleges and universities' future is very much tied to the conditions of their local communities. So I think that's an important consideration in how you think about anchor institutions and leveraging them. And so, again, going back to this notion of moving from being an objectively grounded institution to doing and engaging and being active in local communities. So these are just some thoughts in terms of how to tap anchor institutions. How can anchor institutions be harnessed in a way that can address some of the issues that are confronting communities? So how can anchor institutions be leveraged for economic and community development? And as I mentioned, this notion of being objectively rooted, that doesn't actually tell the whole story because there's so much that needs to happen. And if you really think about the conditions that local communities are facing at this juncture, whether they're educational issues, whether they're health issues, whether they're economic issues, you run the gamut. Safety, homelessness, so many critical factors. What are the kinds of resources that are needed to address those issues? And I think the answers to some of those questions are really in anchor institutions. And so there have to be strategies to leverage those resources and those opportunities going into the future. And I think in a lot of ways, going back to the notion of opportunity, this is a huge opportunity for higher education. The research, the knowledge, the data that can help address issues like crime, that can help address issues like homelessness. I mean, it's in institutions of higher education, so they're really, really critical assets as anchor institutions. And so, thank you. And I mentioned this before, and I think it's critical. The core mission of anchor institutions in very many ways should be tied to the goals of local engagement. And it's very hard to get an institution, whether it's an institution of higher education or a hospital or any other entity, to be deeply engaged in a local community if there really isn't some reason that is tied to the mission of the institution. And I think in higher education, a part of that question is to what degree can community partnerships be beneficial to research, to teaching, those elements that are at the core of an anchor institution. How do you integrate that effectively, I think, is a critical factor. And certainly there's a lot of work that's been going on around the country in this respect. Service learning, which has been a movement that has grown substantially over the years. The notion of students being engaged in their local communities is something that has been popularized throughout higher education, and figuring out ways to apply research. And we know there are lots of challenges in terms of how do you take applied research that can address community needs, but then also be considered scholarly in a way that is relevant to particular disciplines, to particular journals, to influence review and tenure and the like. I mean, how do we figure out how to integrate the core of anchor institutions like universities and these goals of community development? And then when you think on the institutional end for higher education, in terms of the business side, because I think there's an academic side of this conversation, but there's also a business side of the conversation. And when you look at the economic side of the institution in terms of who it hires, where does it purchase, all those economic factors, I think there are also opportunities for mutual benefit in economic inclusion strategies that can both advance economic opportunity in the community and meet employment and purchasing needs for institutions. The next one. And these are just a few different examples of the types of ways in which anchor institutions have been engaged in communities and are engaged in communities. Thinking about, as I mentioned, intentionally local job strategies, so really giving some priority to residents in a locality and thinking about hiring locally as a priority, providing relevant training in growing industries, so industries that are growing in the area. If you can contribute to knowledge needs as an institution, as well as contribute to employment needs, and how to link up all of those different priorities in an area is also an opportunity, I think, for anchor institutions in higher education. Procuring local businesses, providing accessible health care, reviving local housing markets, strengthening local schools. These are all different ways in which anchor institutions can contribute to their communities. And as I mentioned before, higher education can really connect its core mission in applied research, student civic engagement, and connect on that economic side as well. And one thing I think is important is how do you tap the full range of resources in a given college or university when you think about these kinds of partnerships? Because part of what I have seen, and this is some of the these are some of the factors that were addressed in Beyond the Campus, the book that Byron mentioned earlier. You know, when you look inside of an institution of higher education, this is a complex organization. We look at multiple departments, we look at multiple different administrative units, we've got students, faculty, numerous classes, we've got lots of different elements going on at the same time. So how do you connect all of those elements in a creative way and a coordinated way? Because at any college or university that I have visited, there are multiple different programs and initiatives that are going on in communities. Individual faculty members have their own relationships with particular organizations, individual student groups have their own relationships in a particular community, but how do you actually bring those different elements together? How do you coordinate it? And roles like Byron's have been so critical at different colleges and universities in terms of bringing that range of resources together around some coordinated end and some coordinated strategy. And how do you think about all of those different types of engagement at a college or university beyond specific projects or programs, beyond specific classes or specific grants, as a part of something that's broader and more sustained and something that has a higher likelihood of gaining an impact in particular communities. So how do you sort of raise the bar in that sense to gain a greater level of impact in communities is something that's also important. And that's the reality of it all. Some progress has been made in terms of how colleges and universities engage their communities, but we really haven't fully maximized the potential that's out there. So there's certainly many case examples of institutions of higher education that have been getting there a little bit. The University of Pennsylvania is one that is often cited for its engagement in its local community, but even there is a lot of work that is yet to be done. And that, you can go to the next one. And that's one of the reasons why my company, as it's created, has developed a methodology for how to engage different partnerships in local communities and how to provide the kind of strategic advice and research that helps them sort of clarify their purpose and to figure out ways to tap those various resources within their institution and also across multiple different institutions. Because there are, I think, a critical factor when you look forward and you think about what's going on with anchor institutions is the fact that one anchor institution cannot solve any locality's problems by itself. And any anchor institution that focuses only on its own projects and initiatives is not really getting toward the kind of effectiveness and the kind of impact that really is necessary in an environment. So it's very important to figure out ways to look at multiple anchor institutions in an environment and to get them collaborating around a common agenda. And this is a part of what this sort of wheel is about. These are the kinds of things that we think are necessary in order to intervene in a particular type of anchor partnership and actually add to its strengths. How do you assess its potential? How do you identify who the partners are? How do you establish a win-win rationale for every institution that's at the table in a partnership? What's in it for them? I don't think you can have successful partnerships unless there is some understanding of mutual benefit. Mutual benefit is so critical and core to how partnerships can be effective and sustained. Because why are you going to stay at the table if you don't see how you're benefiting? So even though somebody else may be benefiting, that may be the primary thrust of why you're together, you still have to be clear about what's in it for you. And others who are at the table really need to understand the collective and respective priorities at the table. So I think that's an important thing. How do you convene the various partners and do it effectively? What kind of research can be used to help advise and inform how a partnership can work? How do you facilitate strategic plans that help partnerships actually either create themselves or to actually create and design a number of different projects? And designing projects, and I say that that's an interesting part of this, because lots of partnerships are very focused on broad agendas, and they should be. But how do they actually implement their work in an effective and day-to-day real way? And it's very difficult to do that unless there are some specific projects that are actually developed and implemented. So I think that's another important aspect of this. And evaluating progress. You really have to think about impact. And I think that's one of the great challenges in this field. I mean, how do people evaluate their community engagement? So when you think about service learning, and service learning has been critical and catalytic in terms of moving this whole conversation about university engagement from what students can do through their classes to what entire institutions can do in their communities. How does an entire college or university become sort of fully engaged in its local community is a much broader reality than what a few classes can do with their students being involved in the local community. But I mentioned service learning for a reason as it relates to evaluation. Is the fact that service learning traditionally evaluates the time that students spend in their service, in their volunteerism, in their civic engagement. And that, I think, is important on one end, but it doesn't tell the story of how we evaluate progress in these kinds of partnerships. So how do we turn that kind of evaluation into something that's broader and says, what kind of community impact are you actually seeing as a result of the work that's been done? And how do you really begin to think about those potential results from an early point in a partnership? And so I think that's a challenge for a lot of university engagement practices, because so many of the projects that go on through universities are short-term, they're based on a class, they're based on a semester. So how do you create something that's more sustained is a real question that a number of colleges and universities face. So we can go to another one. And I think there are lots of opportunities here too. Just going back to the context. And the skills required in the job market really can be refined by student service in their local communities. The Association of American Colleges and Universities, AACU, is actually coming out with a report in the coming days, I think next week, that is really going to reveal what employers are saying about what they're looking for out of students today. What are they looking for in employees? And so here's a real opportunity. So a lot of service learning work comes out of various classes. We know this is something that is substantial. It's happening at lots of colleges and universities. It's an area where a lot of colleges and universities want to grow. And so how do you justify doing that? And here's a real rationale for it. Because as a part of being engaged in their local communities, students gain particular kinds of real-world, hands-on skills that they can translate into the job market. So I think that's just a real opportunity to think about. And relevant faculty research can strengthen the case for higher education's value. Of course, higher education is constantly having to make a case for why it's important. People are always questioning why higher education has high tuition, questioning whether there's any value or applicability to things that people are learning in classrooms. There's a lot that goes on, a lot of questioning of the value of higher education, even though the evidence is very clear in terms of income opportunities for graduates from colleges and universities versus those who didn't graduate from colleges and universities. There's still a need to really sort of make that case. And in localities, I think that those questions are really pointed sometimes, and particularly for state colleges and universities. So where is there faculty research that can be directly aligned with priority needs in localities, something like job forecasting? I mean, doing that kind of research that is directly applicable and relevant to challenges that are facing a particular locality, I think really do help make that case and help strengthen relationships between institutions of higher education and external partners. And how do you do things like deliberate economic inclusion, as I mentioned before? You know, as a way of reviving local economies. I mean, we all have a stake in strong local economies. So what role can anchor institutions play in making sure that local economies are stronger? And when people have employment, obviously there are lots of factors that are affected by employment and people's ability to purchase things, people's ability to live in the community, people's ability to do lots of other things. So what role can colleges and universities and other anchor institutions play in circulating more dollars for residents in local communities, I think is absolutely another important opportunity. And this sort of deepening, how do you deepen engagement and focus energy? And I don't think there's any necessarily one way to do this, and I think it's important in all this kind of work to really think about local contexts. I mean, local contexts are always different. So there's no one model that works in one place that you can just plop down in another and say, you know, boom, instant partnership effectiveness. It doesn't work that way. But I do think that all anchor institution partnerships should really think about their strategy. Is their strategy going to focus on particular issues? Is it going to focus on a particular locality? And then how do you target the various distinct, discrete projects and initiatives that go on within an anchor institution? How do you target those practices and those programs in a way that actually focuses on a common agenda? And I just mentioned a particular example of that, which is something called the Port Richmond Partnership. It happens to be in Staten Island in New York, and there's a college by the name of Wagner College, which actually is not situated directly in a low-income area, but they have made a decision to invest in the most challenged area in Staten Island and invest a substantial amount of resources in trying to improve that particular community. They made that as a decision because they see that as a part of their core mission as an institution that wants civic engagement to be a critical part of its core curriculum. So they see this as central to what they're doing. So in this particular community in Port Richmond, which is about 10 minutes from that campus, they have decided to focus substantial energy on a comprehensive initiative that addresses education, economic development, and health. And they're concentrating activity inside of their campus and activity between other anchor institutions across Staten Island. So they've created this partnership as a comprehensive effort that has gotten a lot of national attention as a model for a way in which an anchor institution can be strategic about how it aligns its resources in a way that addresses needs in a particular community. So you can go to the next one. And educational pathways is another thing that I think about as one of the sort of obvious ways in which a college or university can connect with local schools. One of these ways in which colleges and universities can make a contribution in their localities and potentially elsewhere, which is in strengthening education. And there's an initiative called the Civic Opportunity Initiative Network, which comes out of a foundation in New York called the New World Foundation, which we have been advising over the years. And this effort is designed to strengthen pathways for young people, particularly those who are from challenged backgrounds, who are in public schools, who would not ordinarily go to a college or university. So it's sort of based on the whole idea that you can sort of provide economic capital to pay for the education of a number of young people who are coming out of high schools who probably wouldn't have graduated. So the program interfaces with juniors in high school, and it brings them into a program that ultimately takes them all the way through to graduation in a college or university. But it has a civic component to it. So it's a college access program plus a civic engagement initiative. So as a part of being in this program. You get the tutoring and you get all the college preparation that you would get in any kind of college access program, but they add to it a civic engagement. The young people are in internships in community-based organizations, particularly community-based organizations from their own communities. So it actually strengthens their identity with their local community. And then they continue to be involved in internships and get leadership development training and get training in trying to influence policy and try to organize in communities and things of that sort all along as this program goes forward. Well, there's a cohort that they created, a pilot cohort that is now in the junior year in college. And of course, the students who enter this program are all still in this program at this particular point in time, because it was based on the theory that if you provide the economic opportunity and the support systems around young people to go through college in this way, they will do it. But it was also based on the philosophy that civic engagement is a way of enhancing learning. And so that's just another feature, I think, of how there may be interesting opportunities for higher education in this kind of work, and understanding how the core mission of institutions of higher education can be served through something like civic engagement. And this program is expanding now. It is not trying to create other cohorts because it costs millions and millions to do this program. So they're trying to figure out a lower cost way to expand the program. So they've connected with different existing college access programs like the Rutgers Future Scholars Program by adding the civic engagement dimension. So the Rutgers Future Scholars Program engages 200 juniors in high school and takes them through a whole college access initiative, and if they perform at a certain level and they receive a certain GPA, they get their college education paid for wherever they want to go. And so they've been doing this for years, and now there are, I think, over 1,000 students who are part of this program. And then this Civic Opportunity Initiative Network now then added a new component to it by getting the students who are part of this program to be in internships, to be involved in community organizing, to be involved in lots of different other things. So the civic engagement aspect is now integrated into their work as they move through colleges and universities. So there are lots of opportunities there as well. So we can go to the next one. Now, there's substantial awareness now, I think, compared to what it used to be. There's much more awareness in the field, sort of among people in the federal government, among people in the foundation community. There's a lot more awareness that anchor institutions can be assets to addressing challenges facing local communities. So that awareness is certainly there, and it's certainly increased. And we really have to figure out how to effectively do this, because this whole field has really evolved over the years. As I mentioned before, student service was really at the core of where the field was maybe 30 years ago, 35, 40 years ago. The conversation was really about how do you get students out there volunteering in the community. And still, that's a core aspect of how colleges and universities engage in their surrounding communities. But a lot of that conversation has evolved now to something far more comprehensive and really focused on universities that are fully engaged in their surrounding communities and pulling upon all of their resources to address certain issues. So there's greater awareness of that. So we can go to the next one. And certainly on a federal policy front, there's been a lot of conversation. So much of this work that goes on in the national field was influenced by a program called COPSI, which was at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and shut down maybe several years ago, a few years ago. But it was around and had its heyday in around the 90s. There was a period of time when there are numerous grants that were being made from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to different colleges and universities to engage in their local communities, usually around some kind of research that would improve an issue that was facing a local community. So even though the program no longer exists, there are numerous different colleges and universities that have received grants from that particular program who are now very involved in this kind of national field, advocating for why it's important for the federal government to think about anchor institutions in their strategies. And there are a number of more recent federal initiatives that have been trying to integrate institutions of higher education into their work, such as the Promise Neighborhoods program, as well as the Strong Cities, Strong Communities, which is actually here in Cleveland, as I understand. And this whole idea is really relevant to all types of federal agencies. So whether you're in the Department of Education, you're in the Department of Commerce, your Department of Housing and Urban Development, whatever issue you're trying to address, they're manifested in localities, for one. And two, you have to leverage resources in localities to actually tackle those issues. They could be health needs, whatever. Whichever issue you're facing, you have to tap local resources if you're going to address them effectively. And so some of these federal agencies have really caught on to this, but many more haven't. And so that's a part of the work that needs to be done. So you can go to the next one. And so, as was mentioned, this Anchor Institutions Task Force. And this is a network. It's a network as well as a think tank. And the purpose of the Anchor Institutions Task Force is to promote the role of anchor institutions in their surrounding communities. So we're really holding this notion very high in our work. And we're saying that if you are going to strengthen and transform communities, you in some way, shape, or form need to leverage anchor institutions. So we see a policy component to this, as was mentioned before, that there are numerous federal agencies that really could have a stake in this, numerous local governments that could really have a stake in this, and we want to try to get as many different government agencies thinking about their anchor institution strategy as possible. There's a lot of knowledge that comes out of the work that's been going on in anchor institutions around the country. We want to mine that knowledge. We want to highlight promising practices. We want to do writing. So we did a literature review on all the writing that's been done recently on anchor institutions, which is going to be coming out in the next couple of months. We commissioned a journal where we got different people who are members of the Anchor Institutions Task Force to write from their experiences as leaders of anchor institutions. What's been working, what are the challenges, things of that sort. We want to enhance the capacity of how anchor institutions engage in their surrounding communities through this kind of knowledge. So that is absolutely critical to what we want to do. So we want to influence policy. We want to strengthen the knowledge base of what it means for an anchor institution to be involved in its community. And we want to build the capacity of anchor institutions to engage in their local communities. We have over 200 members in this Anchor Institutions Task Force. The members are individuals who represent anchor institutions and other partners. They believe in the values and the purpose of the task force. And so in lots of ways, we're creating a policy voice that can really advocate on behalf of this particular kind of work. We're not a lobbying organization in any way, shape, or form. We really want to be a resource. We want to be a knowledge resource to many people who are out there about what's possible as far as these partnerships are concerned. And so for us structurally at Marga Incorporated, this is something that we actually coordinate, and we coordinated in partnership with the University of Pennsylvania. And policy really was sort of the driver for how the task force got created, because as the new administration was coming in 2009, there was a desire to sort of inform the Department of Housing and Urban Development about different key trends. So Ira Harkavy at the University of Pennsylvania was asked to bring together a group of people in the field who have really been working on anchor institution engagement, and we all came together and wrote a chapter in a book that's called Retooling Hud. And in this book, Retooling HUD, it was submitted to HUD as a way to just inform them about what's going on in the field and give them ideas about ways that they can innovate. So we ultimately decided, okay, so we've created this group to write a report. What are we going to do about it? And so we said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could actually have an ongoing association that would continue to promote this idea and would continue to engage government and other partners. And that's ultimately how the Anchor Institutions Task Force came into being. So you can go to the next. And we have over 200 members now, and we're creating subgroups within the task force with specific interest areas. And we're really framed in a way that encompasses the various types of anchor institutions. As I mentioned at the beginning, the definition of anchor institutions is constantly evolving. There are various types of anchor institutions, and we want to be a task force that is actually relevant to all those different types. And right now, we're heavily represented by higher education. And that's partly because higher education really has been catalytic as a field across the country in terms of really holding high the need for institutions of higher education to be locally engaged and identifying as anchor institutions and really seeing that as an opportunity. And so we have all different types of institutions of higher education under this umbrella. Public universities, private universities, community colleges, urban, rural, small, big, they're all within the task force, and our framing is broad enough to continue to bring in hospitals, libraries, museums, community foundations, other types of anchors as well. So we really have a very all-encompassing vision for where the task force can ultimately go. So that's a lot of our thinking about this. And we actually have an annual conference every year, and our annual conference is on December 10th this year, and it will be held at Johns Hopkins University. And I mentioned before the task force is a values-driven entity. And so these are the values of the Anchor Institutions Task Force: collaboration and partnership, equity and social justice, democracy and democratic practice, commitment to place and community. So for us, going back to the very beginning, it's not good enough to just be objectively anchored in a community. That what we are encouraging is that you should be more engaged, but not only more engaged, but there's a way to engage. And a part of the way to engage is to think about these kinds of factors. So the people who join the task force believe in these particular values, and these are the values that we're promoting as we think about anchor institutions. So you can go to the next one. And my last couple slides are just really on sort of the next frontier. Where is this field going? What are some interesting developments? What are some evolving conversations? Things of that sort. And again, going back to this notion of being comprehensive as you think about an anchor institution. Colleges and universities and other anchor institutions are complex organizations. They have multiple parts within them. So it's very hard to get sort of one mind on why it's important to engage in your local community. So that's hard work to do. But there's a lot that we can do to coordinate the various activities that go on in institutions. So how do we tap the full range of resources at a given anchor institution? How do we get beyond singular programs when we think about anchor institutions? So a particular class, a particular grant project, I mean, all of those have their own value. But if we're really thinking about leveraging anchor institutions in a way that can transform communities, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that respect, and we need some more coordinated resources and activities. And building internal will throughout institutions, I think, is so essential, because even to this day, as surely there's more conversation about anchor institutions, but the reality is everyone is not necessarily going to see this as a priority in the institution. Everyone is not necessarily going to see local engagement as the business of their institution or as something that actually exhibits their core mission as an institution, or see it as scholarly, or see it as anything that is related to why students are at colleges and universities. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to sort of make the case internally. And as you heard throughout this presentation, I believe the case can be made internally and see lots of opportunities. And so how do you engage in that kind of conversation? Because there are real opportunities there. Systemically enhancing capacity to create and sustain effective local engagement. And going back to, how do you do it in a sustained way? And how do you do it effectively? What are the institutional mechanisms that have to be in place? Now, faculty aren't going to go out and spend hours and days in communities if they don't see that there's an opportunity to actually enhance their scholarly portfolio. And so how do we think about integrating into review, into tenure and promotion, the more applied forms of activity in local communities in terms of scholarship. So how do you sort of redefine scholarship in a way that actually makes sense to this model of anchor institutions being engaged? How do you develop processes that enable shared decisions? So in all of these kinds of partnerships, what are the appropriate processes? If we are going to be democratic in partnerships, if we are wanting to make sure that resident voices are at the table alongside anchor institution voices, how do you figure out some way to create shared decision making, and what are the mechanisms to do that? I think that's an important area as you sort of look into the future and where things are going. Ensuring activities achieve tangible results and building the systems to adequately measure progress. I mentioned that before around evaluation. I mean, it's wonderful to do projects that are beneficial primarily to students and faculty, but if we're going to actually make some change and in a lot of ways take advantage of the opportunities that were mentioned in this discussion, we've got to figure out ways to evaluate and to really think about what kind of impact on the community side of the equation do we want, and also what kind of impact do we want on the scholarly side and on the teaching side of it too. So how do we really be clear? How can we be as clear as possible about what are appropriate outcomes for this kind of work for all parties who are involved? And then if we understand appropriate outcomes, how do we actually measure that? What are the best mechanisms to do that? So that's something to think about as well. And of course, securing greater internal and external resources to support anchor engagement. Now, this kind of work, it creates its own expenses. And so we really have to be strategic about figuring out what are the best ways to garner resources for it. And I think that when we look from an opportunistic perspective, you can go to the next slide, but when we look from an opportunistic perspective, there are ways for this kind of work to actually generate new opportunities, generate revenue, generate exposure. So that's a strategic question I think Neil really needs to get figured out. And also in the next frontier, how do we get the full range of people who have a stake in local communities collaborating with each other? Multi-institutional and cross-sector partnerships. And that seems to be an emerging trend in a lot of different parts of the country. Many colleges and universities which were focused on their own programs as an institution maybe 10 or 20 years ago are now talking more about how they are connecting and working with other anchor institutions in their locality, working with local government and the like. Now, these are almost like new forms of governance. They have many features and many factors at work. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really understand what it takes to make effective cross-sector partnerships. And so the most recent book that I wrote is actually on this topic, strategic public-private partnerships. And how do you really maintain ongoing partnerships? And we talked about this a little bit earlier today. What's the right mechanism for it? Do you create a new organization if you've got multiple different entities and you want to keep a partnership going? What do you do? Do you house the activity inside one of the anchor institutions? There are lots of different questions that need to get figured out here, and that's another area where there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of connecting the various efforts that are going on across the country. I mean, there is a lot of conversation about anchor institutions, and see, on the national level, just like you'll find inside of an institution, you've got many players who are having the same conversation but not necessarily coordinating with each other. And that's one of the things we really wanted to do with the Anchor Institutions Task Force, is to create an entity that really anyone could join. Anyone who really believes in these particular ideas and this particular role for anchor institutions can come to the table. So by doing that, we could really get across all the different organizations that are having this conversation and bring it into one discussion. So I think that's another important one. And then there's nothing left to be said except thank you. But I appreciate your time and your patience in listening to me talk about this issue, which I believe is absolutely essential and critical, and And hopefully, as you think through your own strategies as an institution and think through how you collaborate inside of this entity, there were some kernels of wisdom that could be instructive to you as you go forward. But thanks again for your time.
Those of you who have been to some previous conversations know we do want to take a minute, take a deep breath, and take the pulse of the room with what you heard. And so I would ask, first of all, if you're leaving, do sign the sign-in sheet. But before you do, if you can take just 5 minutes with your table, and I think we have a scribe or facilitator at each table, and just very briefly, your top-of-mind reaction to what you heard.
I just took that generally that place matters. And I think as Cleveland State has, and the Euclid Corridor project has really changed the dynamics just in the last 7-8 years, Cleveland State becomes a more desirable place to go to, not only just go to school and kind of commute in, but to live here. So
we're currently invested in building a residential neighborhood. To what extent are we using community resources to help make this happen rather than simply building community resources? And is this going to be integrated locally, or are we trying to insulate ourselves?
They're going to be like the foundation of that. So if you have better education and all that, it's going to lead to a better anchor institution.
So, and with you saying that, talking about the access or the college access, you're saying that maybe the institutions themselves, the higher ed ones, should have, I guess, in place more comprehensive programming, or so to speak, resource right for students to help them.
How can that transition be made?
Finding a balance.
Finding a balance in which jobs for profit are also included in the equation.
So we're building housing and that kind of thing. But the problem there is it's not affordable. So who lives in that space, and who have we displaced to build that space? So as we think about it, I don't know that we want to do competing activities in the name of civic engagement.
Definitely collaborative. We're not seen as sort of the enemy or the outside force. It's not
That we become neighbors.
right.
what I think is also a challenge too is what happens when these organizations that can and want to be anchor institutions, they need just as much as maybe the community. So, how do you form, how can other anchor institutions come in and make sure everything's mutually beneficial? Because sometimes I think that's the challenge too, is how are you sure everybody's
To find that balance.
right? And that goes back to place too, because schools just by place are often, or used to be, I guess. It's interesting because I think that's changing too. As schools are closed or things move around, that notion of place changes.
You can come to this facility and use this computer because you are a resident and we are neighbors, and you don't have to have an account at their bank to do it. It's a neighborhood community facility, so they become an anchor and a partner.
We are trying to evaluate, that's why I brought that issue, to evaluate how the investment in the community helps the university, because we are asking the student at the end of the year how many have been offered a job on their field placement. So, for example, this year at least we have 7 students who have been hired. See, at the in the organization where they are working. So that is
That's good feedback.
yes, because
And it shows success.
yes.
All right, let's. How about just a quick one thing from each table that you came up with, or that was shared?
CSU alone can't do it. Has to partner, the university or any anchor institution has to partner with other anchor institutions in order to be successful at this complicated work.
Great, good. So that's a good point that came out. I'm sure others had that. How about another table? What did you all get, Lee? Where?
One of the things that resonated strongly was the idea of skill refinement within CSU or the institution, students within the institution, and how it contributes to community growth.
Okay, good.
And we did see several challenges, which we can continue talking about for a long time.
Okay.
One of the first things that was raised was the Boston University example, how they have this record enrollment, and we wondered if Cleveland State would be getting 50,000 applicants.
There you go.
But the point of the place mattering, and that Cleveland State becomes more desirable as the development on Euclid Avenue happens, and the development of East 4th Street, and the Student Center now. We were talking about going on college visits with some of our own children and seeing, the rec center is much better than it was before, so the place matters.
So we discussed the fact that CSU has an opportunity to help with economic development in the area, especially regarding jobs. You're seeing all the new buildings and things like that, and so we have an opportunity to help.
First of all, we want to thank the other two tables because you've kind of pointed out the challenges that we were discussing in terms of the shift from profit to nonprofit. How does that shift help to create employment, help to create jobs? And I think both of these tables have kind of addressed that, the rec center, things like that, which then brings us back to the university internally, creating incentives for faculty, and particularly faculties in the humanities. How can we get the humanities to be seen as contributing to employment? They seem to be not mutually inclusive, when in fact they are. But how do we change the mindset within the institution, within the disciplines themselves, that the humanities then can contribute to employment as we move to a profitable nonprofit status?
Good. Yeah, this is sort of this interesting transition from, we had these conversations about what is the role of faculty and the role of students and kind of internal, and this is sort of steps out and says, well, this institution holistically in its array of assets, how do they align at having the kind of impact and transformation we're talking about? So it really is the anchor institutional role is an interesting way to come at it. So I don't know, David, from what you've heard, if any feedback, and if so, you might share it, and if not, or when you're done, we'll.
Yeah, I'll just say something quickly and then take some questions. Thank you for that. I feel like I'm teaching a class now, and then you've all been asked to tell me what you've learned. And I really enjoyed that. That was great, because all of your comments were really about the opportunity frame of it. And we know there are lots of challenges, tons and tons and tons of challenges to doing this. But I think if we look at it from an opportunity frame, we're much better positioned to address the challenges. So I really appreciated all of these responses. So I'll just take some questions. Yes, sir.
Some examples about how institutions have seen, we talked about the mutual benefit to both sides, and I think oftentimes universities have seen it like they're doing the right thing or a good thing by doing a project, but don't necessarily benefit from those, or the students benefit, which is important, but the institution itself doesn't benefit. So are there some institutional benefits that you could point to?
Yeah, I was earlier we were talking about Duke University, because I think that some of the institutional benefit conversation and community benefit conversation, creating the mutual benefit, is partly to do with how you approach the process. I mean, because at Duke University, when they created their Duke-Durham Neighborhood Partnership, which is actually called something else now, but I just don't remember the new name. When they created it, they identified 12 different neighborhoods around Durham where they wanted to engage locally. And they established ongoing exchange and dialogue in those neighborhoods between residents and stakeholders at the college and university to really identify what are their sort of shared interests and what are their priorities. And so that ended up driving what they ultimately ended up doing. And now one of the great examples, which you mentioned when we were talking yesterday, is Tulane University, which revamped its curriculum in the face of Katrina to then focus primarily on civic engagement. They increased the number of service learning classes that they offer tremendously, and basically reshaped how they pitched the university. Because prior to Katrina, students were coming there from all over the country, and they wanted to sort of be in New Orleans and be at a great university. And then Katrina came and changed the entire model. So they went the other direction. Instead of saying, oh my God, what are we gonna do? They looked at the challenge left in the community as an opportunity, and basically sold the idea that students could come to Tulane University to be a part of an experience of rebuilding New Orleans. And they integrated that throughout their classes. And so now their enrollment is up, and the number of applications is at its highest level in its history, doubled from what it used to be. And University of Pennsylvania has some similar kinds of stories, because their local engagement really did shape a little bit of their institutional identity and really helped shape their popularity as an institution, which also encouraged a number of people to apply. So, and then, with you, I know your table talked about Boston University. I mean, again, this notion of place. When a place is considered to be desirable, and that has lots of different definitions, because you see Tulane turned the notion of desirable on its head and basically said your experience is going to be great because you're going to be helping to solve a challenging situation, but the quality of the place in which you're situated is still so critical in higher education. No matter how much technology is out there, all that's been changing about how people think about knowledge and how it's getting to people, still to this day, place matters that much. And for higher education, it still matters a tremendous amount. And how students are deciding where to go to college is based on the experience that they are imagining for themselves inside of the institution. So I think that is one critical institutional benefit that can come from some of this kind of work. Yes?
Well, we were also talking about incentivizing teacher scholars
It's a big issue.
To get rewarded for civic engagement. And it seems like that's a really big challenge.
It is.
It seems like tenure and promotion is mostly about publishing and then service within the department and then teaching. So how on top of that do you influence administrators, I suppose, to allow there to be civic engagement included into that?
Right. Yeah, it's a tremendous challenge, and some of it is by the institution. It's a greater challenge at some institutions than at others. Some institutions have created a climate where they've been, like a Michigan State University is an example of an institution that has gone to some lengths to actually address this particular issue. Imagining America is an organization, sort of another national network, largely of faculty who are in the humanities, actually. They have actually focused specifically on tenure and review, and they have created essentially a toolkit on how to help navigate these issues inside of your institution. And then I also think when it comes to publishing, to what degree does the engagement that you're involved in as a faculty member become publishable? And so how do you make sure to write on the various forms of engagement that you're a part of? I think that is another way, but this dialogue is going on all over the country, and it is a hard one. And people haven't sort of readily embraced it, but there are a few now resources out there that are really starting to move the conversation. So I think there's some opportunity in that respect.
since we're talking about Boston a little bit, where do you put Northeastern on this sort of spectrum of engagement, since embedded in their curriculum is this co-op model that puts students directly into the community?
Yeah.
Where does that fit in all of this?
I'm not familiar with the full details of what they've been doing at Northeastern. But, I mean, what you're describing there, I mean, certainly fits and makes sense in terms of an engagement model. I mean, this is an institution that has really sort of placed its stake, as far as I know, on an engaged experience as an institution. I don't know all the details of what they've done, but I know this is an institution that has really, made some effort in this respect. And one that, and that's why I say with the tenure question, it's sort of like it depends on the institution, right? Because you have to ask the question, where are the institutions that have been able to, as I was talking about, been able to integrate into the core mission this notion of civic engagement and being involved. And I think that is an institution that has done some work on that. And there are lots of institutions where you've got numerous faculty, numerous students who are continuing to do this kind of work, but they don't necessarily have the full institutional support.
How do you do that piece? Because CSU, you had a slide that listed kind of all of the things that an engaged anchor institution would do. Support the local public school, check. They do economic development locally, check. They revitalize the local housing market, check. They purchase locally, check. Like, they're doing all of that. And yet there's still the sense that it's not fully embedded in the DNA of the institution yet. So how do you go from, we do all of these things, to we believe, we feel, we would never not do all of these things?
Right. I mean, I think that comes on lots of levels. I mean, I think there's a leadership question. I mean, certainly I think the leadership of the institution. I think the Byron-like positions at various colleges and universities have been critical in terms of getting faculty and students sort of coordinating the various activities that you're involved in. I think you absolutely have to integrate this kind of work into curriculum. It can't be considered to be a sort of on the side, interesting, ancillary, charitable. It cannot be on the margins. It has to be in the center. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get it there. I mean, University of Pennsylvania focused on service learning classes. They have more service learning classes than any institution in the country, as far as I know, right now. So getting it into the classes was one critical way that they really began to sort of get it there. Getting it across disciplines and across multiple departments is another way of really getting it there. But getting that buy-in at leadership is important. We are doing some work with George Washington University right now, and part of what we're doing in a strategic planning process with them is looking at the strategic plan for the entire institution and trying to figure out, okay, so within the strategic plan for the entire institution, where are the opportunities for engagement? And chances are the opportunities are there. When you look at the mission of any institution of higher education, was kind of the whole framing of Beyond the Campus, the book that was mentioned earlier, is that if you look at the mission of any institution of higher education, you can find in some way, shape, or form some alignment with the notion of being engaged externally. And so getting people to really understand that on that level, but it helps when you have a president or a provost really pushing it. It helps when you have trustees pushing it. Trustees can really help in some sense because presidents turn over. Faculty are usually there longer than the leadership of the institution. So engaging it in the faculty, embedding it in the faculty is critical, but embedding it in leadership is critical. And trustees are essential because they are the ones who hire the president. And so as the presidents turn over, as they often do in some cases, you want to make sure that the work is sustained. And that's one thing that University of Pennsylvania has done, again, to that model, is that they've now gone through, they're on their third president who's really advocating for this kind of local engagement. And part of the reason why that happened is because the trustees kept the conversation alive from one president to the next. But you also had multiple players around the institution really buying into this. So now more hands are going up. Yes.
Yes, on the graph regarding Marga.
Yes, yeah, the wheel.
There are 8 sections, and among those 8 sections, 3 are related to evaluation, research, evaluating progress, and assessing partnership. So, what is the level of evaluation in that whole system of engagement?
The level of evaluation?
Of evaluation, because I see that it seems that it is really very important.
I think it is, yeah. I think it is. I think that a lot of this has to do with defining goals. I mean, and so when 50 different initiatives are going on a campus, and each one has its own agenda in the community. It's all fine and good. I did it myself when I was a faculty member, because I've taught. I've been a faculty member at 2 different universities, and I used to have my students go out into the community, work with different organizations and things of that sort. I was the one who identified the organizations that we should work with and things of that sort. But what was important to me in those classes was that the organizations got something of value. So evaluation in that context, in those discrete contexts, from each different project, partnership, what have you, it was about defining goals up front. And so there were goals for the students, and there were goals for the community organization. So I think in the various discrete partnerships, there's evaluation at that level. But then there's also evaluation on the whole. So when you think about the aggregate of all those different programs, and you think about what you really want to ultimately achieve in a community context, do you want to enhance employment? Do you want to improve education? I mean, what are the goals there, and how do you actually assess them? So I think that is another level of the conversation with evaluation as well. You had a question.
Actually, that was my question, had to do with assessment, and particularly when you're working with the humanities. I mean, nothing scares us more than numbers. So how do we evaluate in a way that's identifiable?
Yeah. The humanities.
Say it that way.
Oh, no. I'm a believer. Big believer. I just think that, with the humanities, it's always tricky because there's so much tremendous value there when we think about this notion of engagement, and we think about how to improve communities. There's so much value there. The humanities really promote the kind of practices that we're talking about here in terms of critical thinking and collaboration and things of that sort. The humanities sort of facilitates that. But when you think about the sort of arts dimension of the humanities, that's also absolutely important and critical. The performing arts can open up pathways to conversations that ordinarily wouldn't even happen. I mean, so where are there places where the conversations are stuck because people are caught up on history, or they're caught up on challenges around historical issues, racial issues, all sorts of factors that are going to be real in a community context so how do you leverage the tools of the humanities to help facilitate conversation? I mean, I think that's one. But I also think there are economic development factors, when you think about the arts. The reality is that, when you think about recreation in a community context, which I imagine is going to be something you're going to be talking about increasingly as you think about improving the quality of life in this area. What's the recreation? Where's the theater? Where's the music? All of that plays a critical role. So I think there's a lot there, but it tends to not get sort of fully unpacked to the degree that it could or should. But I think there's a lot of opportunity in that respect. But again, Imagining America, another resource. Yes. I mean, Imagining America has a lot to offer in this respect.
I think a big takeaway for us in the conversation is sort of what, and a lot of our questions were leaning this way, and what you talked about, which is there is this dichotomy of individual partnership kinds of exchanges between individual faculty and community partners or groups of faculty. And then there's the roll-up of all of that in terms of the institution's impact and the broad impact on a community. And it was asked you answered in terms of metrics and evaluation happening two ways. But it just makes this issue of engagement in a comprehensive way, in a way to think about it as an anchor institution, very complex. And the alignment of those pieces are part of what's most difficult for a complex institution like the university. So this definitely fuels the dialogue and conversation, so much so that we want to continue to have that. And I know we've talked a little bit about the online process for that, and I think where we are, Dan, you want to give us a very
so over at the civiccommons.com, you go to the civiccommons.com/CSU, go down to the bottom of that page after you see the beautiful video of Byron and a short brief letter from him. The most recent conversation is one that we created to capture all of the thinking in the month of April. Since the speakers are coming so quickly, once a week, it seemed to make more sense rather than to have 4 discrete conversations to try and bring together the many threads of conversation. So as I understand it, Byron, you're going to be posting 1 or 2 questions a week that you'd like people to engage with. And I'm going to put you on the spot and say you'll put one up today.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll write it for you if you want. And then we'll get an email out to everybody so that you can, we can keep this conversation going, and hopefully weave it in with the conversation, the ongoing dialogue from last week and what's coming up with Mark Chubb and then Dr. Saltmarsh.
And we're asking the speakers to check in on that dialogue from time to time, and incorporate thoughts they may have. So keep watch on what's happening.
Yeah, if you could add the link to Civic to your email.
It'll be in the email.
It is complex to go.
It'll be in the email.
Just it is there, so we can go through.
We'll make sure you've got 8 different ways to get there. Okay.
Next week, Mark Chubb, many of you know, Case, was on faculty in Levin, is coming, and I think he may actually have a colleague. And this is to really talk about some of the nitty-gritty work of, okay, how really do you do these partnerships at the community level, at the resident level? How do you cross these lines and bridges? How do you really create democratic partnerships and exchanges, and what are the challenges and pitfalls, and how do you overcome those in a real practical way? So that, I think that's going to be really a real contribution to the dialogue. But we definitely want to thank you, David, for your